Vietnam is a country heavily influenced by communism introduced by China immediately prior to the Vietnam War. The nationalization of assets, liberty, and through this regime hindered the economy's growth and resulted in ubiquitous civil unrest. In order to alleviate tensions and help rebuild their economy, several recent solutions have been presented.
Hi, my name is Eva and I will be speaking about the origin of Vietnam's communism. The Vietnam Wars has roots in Vietnam's centuries of domination by imperialism and colonial powers. First China, which ruled ancient Vietnam, and then France, which took control of Vietnam in the late 1800s and established French Indochina, the movement. In the early 1900s, nationalist movements emerged, demanding more self-governed and less French influence. The most prominent of these groups was led by a communist leader known as Ho Chi Minh. He founded a militant nationalist organization called the Viet Minh. During World War II, the French was occupied by the Nazi Germany, completely losing foot in Vietnam, and Japan took control of the country. The Vietnam resisted the Japanese oppression and extended its power base throughout Vietnam. Eventually, Vietnam surrendered. Viet Minh took over. Ming's force took the capital of Hanoi and declared Vietnam to be an independent country, the Republic of Vietnam. French refused to accept and recognize Ho's declarations. He appealed for aid from the United States. Here is the letter of Ho Chi Minh to the United States, which was distrusted because the United States was against communism. So he went against France. The fight of recognition continued between Ho Chi Minh and French leaders, leading to the First Indochina War until 1954, when a humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu promoted France to seek a peace settlement. The peace settlement divided Vietnam into northern and southern Vietnam. The Geneva Accords in 1954 was a division between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh took over the northern side, and the French imperialists took over the southern side. The Cold War and the domino theory. At this point, the U.S. Cold War foreign policy began to play a major part in Vietnam. U.S. policy at the time was dominated by the domino theory, which believed that the fall of northern Vietnam would cause all of the Southeast Asia to fall, setting off a sort of communism chain reaction. Within a year, the U.S. aided South Asia. Eventually, during this period, the U.S. was funding South Vietnam so they can take over the communism, but it didn't work because the U.S. got caught involved in corrupt actions, causing the support they were providing to the southern Vietnam to dwindle. President Nixon resigned his presidency, and northern Vietnam stepped up to southern Vietnam and finally launching an all-out offense. Southern and northern Vietnam reunited the country under the communist rule, and that's how communism was created in Vietnam.
The impact of the economy. Communism had a big impact on the economy. First, nationalizing assets and resources was disastrous to the economy. Most former owners were not compensated for their loss in net loss and potential income. People became enslaved to things due to shortage, also known as materialistic. Second, placing their management into hands of officials that don't deserve the position had a great effect. People in the government possess neither the competence nor motivation to oversee everything, and everything is running efficiently. It shows you right here the government spending, which is right here, how it started out freely and it kind of got, well, it went freer. And People look at themselves as dependents on the government to make their decisions, which is not necessarily the best for them. The third is liberty is at stake in the communist economy. Controlling the people's assets, such as their land, ultimately lead to destruction. Historical evidence, writes Richard Pipes in his book, Communism, A History, written in 2001, indicates that the liberties of individuals can only be protected when property rights are firmly guaranteed, because these rights constitute the most effective barrier to states' encroachments. People are no longer in control of their lives and torn down to no thoughts of their own but the government's, primarily due to the government that Vietnam has today.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because of Ho Chi Minh's fight for Vietnam independence and invited communism into Vietnam, that made people's lives even worse. The U.S. government predicted that communism would have a domino effect into other countries, so they sent their troops to Vietnam to help. U.S. troops did fight against the communism, but they also killed the lives of many innocent people by attacking the family in the villages that were controlled by the communists. According to my parents, Annie and Joseph Nguyen, communists would take properties and valuables from people and keep them to themselves. The wealthiest of Vietnamans became poor overnight and were stripped of all their belongings. The government officials became richer and more powerful, including more men to overpower the citizens. The communists were able to get whatever they wanted, and a slight of refusal would lead to punishments of beating and even death. Hoa Tran, a son of a wealthy businessman, relives his horrific experience with CNN.com. At the age of 14, communist barges into his home and handcuffs his father with accusations of him being a CIA agent. Not only Khan's father lost 3 years of his life in an education camp, he lost 10 properties. He lost all 10 of his properties. The communists created education camps which were told to teach and help people how to act like members of the communist society, but in reality it was created to control and punish those who were disobedient. Among these captives were my mother, father, 2 uncles, and their wives. They witnessed many beatings, killings, starvations, and raping without any hesitation from the communists. They saw that the only way of survival was to escape the camps. They hatched a successful plan that resulted in freedom and deaths of 3 guards. These poor and harsh conditions that the people of Vietnam had to endure is the reason that people escaped to America. Thank you.
Although it is commonly mistaken for a communist state, Vietnam is currently a socialist state which has adopted a communist way of life. Similar to the other socialist states, Vietnam advocates that means or resources used in the production of wealth, as well as the distribution and exchange of wealth, should be regulated by a single centralized body. Since April of 1922, the Communist Party of Vietnam has controlled all aspects of the country's government, politics, and society. Subordinate to the Communist Party of Vietnam, the national governing body, is the state government, which, in order to efficiently execute its duties, is composed of several branches. The National Assembly of Vietnam makes up the unicameral or single-chambered legislative branch of the Communist Party of Vietnam. Unlike the legislative branch, several groups make up the executive branch. The first position in the executive branch is the chief or head of state, which is the president position. The second position in the executive branch is the head of government, which is composed of a prime minister and several deputy prime ministers. The cabinet, which is formed of individuals appointed by the president based on a proposal by the prime minister and then confirmed by the National Assembly, is the remaining class of the executive branch. The judicial branch, the third and final sector of Vietnam's government, is also formed by multiple subgroups. The Chief of Justice, who is elected by the National Assembly on the President's recommendation, along with 13 judges appointed by the President, comprise the Supreme People's Court, which is the highest court according to the United States Central Intelligence Agency, also known as the CIA. Other subordinate groups, such as the Court of Appeals, the People's Special Court, and the Central military court constitute the remaining judicial authorities of Vietnam. And the chain of power, it goes from the Communist Party of Vietnam, which is composed of all these. The National Assembly is the legislative branch, but it has the highest level of state power over the executive and the judicial, and these are the prime ministers.
On July 25th, 2013, the New York Times reported on President Tuan Tan Son, Vietnam's current head of state, who brought a copy of Ho Chi Minh's letter to Truman. Ho Chi Minh's letter to Truman to meet with Barack Obama in order to deepen international ties, negotiate an increase in trade, and to discuss concerns regarding human rights in Vietnam. The presence of the letter that Truman ignored, which led to the country's plunge into communism, was a display of President Son that Vietnamese harbored no ill will towards the American government and its people. The administration hoped that opening trade negotiations and military dialogue would be an incentive for Vietnam to change, to soften its authoritarian edge, leading to an improvement of treatment of Vietnam's workers. In 2013, September 2013, 2 months after President Son met with Obama, there were widespread crackdowns and drastic degradations in the treatment of workers, leading to a rehardening of tension between the U.S. and Vietnam. According to Tran Le Thuy and John Ruich of the Reuters, the only way to achieve reform and prosperity would be to restore people's faith in their government. In order to do this, Vietnam should assess 3 major points prior to any major change occurring.
This is a practice.
Public investment needs to be made to increase the quality of life for all of Vietnam's citizens, not just the elite. Such actions would alleviate tensions with other countries, including the U.S. and Denmark, Vietnam's largest donor of foreign aid. This would in turn increase their trade, thereby stimulating its economy. That, coupled with a decrease in government spending. A figure that has been on a steady decline since 2002. All of this will increase their finances and increase their prosperity and alleviate the tensions with the U.S. and Vietnam and lower the impact of communism on Vietnam. To conclude, Vietnam's economy and governmental model has drastically changed over the years. Although it has been subjected to Chinese takeover and economic turmoil, steps have been taken by the Vietnamese government to reform the country to its former glory.
Now we do the countdown.
No, yeah, that's the next.